Hey everybody, it's Alan Morrison here with another episode of the GraphRAG Curator podcast, and I'm delighted today to share with you an interview I did a while back with Adam Kimball of Applied Graphs, but it's still just totally up to date because Adam is so up to date. Adam Kimball of Applied Graphs is both a knowledge engineer and a software architect. And so he's got this point of view that includes both sides of that picture. He's bridging the gap between the two. And so he takes advantage of all sorts of technologies on either side and brings them together in a fascinating way. And so I wanted to get his perspective on agentic AI, which is still a hot topic, still something everybody is thinking about how to do more with. And the semantic graphs component is something I'm fond of and cover all the time. But Adam's got this perspective on software architecture generally and tooling that's also of use to complement what happens in the semantic metadata space. So I hope you enjoy it.
Adam, thanks for joining again.
Absolutely. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. So we're going to focus specifically on agentic AI and something that's top of mind for many executives and enterprises and how to take advantage of it because there are some impressive capabilities and there's also quite a bit of hesitancy about trying to use agentic AI because of the risks. And I'm wondering if we could just unpack this issue from your perspective. What have you been seeing, and what should execs be thinking about that you've come across?
No, it's been an interesting journey. I mean, I think the first 100 times or whatever I heard the term agentic AI, I was, I don't know, like nonplussed by it. It just sounded like the next sort of crazy vaporware, ridiculousness. But then I had to be humbled by it because I started to, internalize it and think about it more. And I watched how I worked in apps and all the buttons I had to click and all the menus I had to comprehend and all the things that I had to do to like do a task, right? Like complicated stuff from the as if you're a software developer and you're trying to fix a bug, well you're going to fix the bug and you're going to make a PR and you're going to connect the PR to the bug and all these other things. Like there's like a multi-step thing going on there that takes time and you don't want to deal with it. And so I had this moment a while ago where I realized, man, like the agentic AI could really just eat the user interface. Like the user interface could just become drastically simpler and even applications themselves could be essentially invisible, and it could be a huge change. And so we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I mean, we're what we're talking about agentic AI is now really it seems like it's going to be whether or not Copilot's capable of modifying the text in Word, or what's going on in Cursor when you're writing code and things like that. But as we get deeper into MCP, these agents are doing a lot more, and they're going to have other agents, and they're going to be able to discover other agents, and they're going to be able to accomplish quite a lot. And so I think just simply like unpacking agentic AI itself is worthy of just taking some time and watching how you work in an application and wondering how much of what you're doing is actually the true thought work that we pay people to do versus the trapeze act of remembering how a UI works and making your way through it. So I think that's super interesting thing to think about. But when I think about kind of the data level of agentic systems, the thing that I'm most, I think, suspicious of is that language itself is the integration glue between all of this. That if you had a number of agents and those agents were capable of communicating with each other, that on some level, like just deciphering the language, reading the REST endpoints, understanding the MCP definitions is enough. I often like to think about some of the like most basic things that I would want to use agents for, and that's often in workflows, right? There's like some document comes in. Is it an invoice? It is an invoice. Is it an invoice for real property or is it an invoice for services? It's an invoice for services. Like imagine any sort of financial workflow where people need to archive things, they need to audit things, they need to understand it. There's so much reference data in there, right? It's like even basic things. There's a new lead. Okay, well, where are you gonna route this new lead? Well, where'd it come from? Okay, that's you can figure out where it came from. What are your sales offices? Right. So, okay, you need to look up what a sales office is. And there's 13 of these sales offices. And so there's another agent that can answer the question about what are the sales offices. And then you ask, well, how should I distribute this lead to that sales office? Where does it go? Right. So there's all of these like categorical types of data around. It's often reference data, right?
Yeah.
I want to order some sweaters. Okay. Are they V-neck? Are they not? I mean, we have all this categorical data all over the place. And if we're thinking about language, trying to query and filter and understand all this categorical data, I think we're going to find a ton of just impedance mismatches and essentially like contextual boundaries that get blurry. And so in many ways, a lot of the like categorical data that we have between our systems that silos our systems today, I do believe it's going to be the same problem when you've got agents, right? It's like the meaning of this data over here is this, and the meaning of the same data over that is this. How do you organize it? How do you get the matching there? How do you join that data together? So when I think about semantics and agents, I think about being able to allow the agents to use categorical data, to be able to get that categorical data from trusted sources of master and reference data, and be able to query things. So, that's really the upshot for me is that systems that query are going to be more accurate than systems that inference. Systems that generate tokens. I would rather generate tokens to run a query to get the data back than I would generate tokens to answer the question that's also in the database, right? And that's really, I think, what I think about a lot right now with agents and semantics.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's a philosophy of infrastructure that has to be in place for it to accomplish what you're talking about. And there's a maturity curve that, for example, clients, companies might need to think about in terms of where they are in terms of their infrastructure transformation at the data layer so that they can accomplish this kind of contextualization that you're talking about. What's your experience been with companies just sort of working on, you know, getting familiar with what level of maturity they're at? How do you work with them from there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I generally think about maturity levels in terms of how much do you know about your own schemas. This is a tricky question, but obviously there's a bunch of databases around. Those databases have schemas. Inside of those databases, a lot of data that's important to you that you need to be able to reason about, that you probably need to hook up to these agents. And the question is, what can an agent learn about your data by ingesting and understanding the schema, right? Like if you have incredibly well-named columns and things like that, maybe an LLM could actually learn what's going on in your database simply from reading the columns. That's pretty unlikely given the way that most database architects kind of put together their tables. So the next question is like, is there anything in those schemas that tells an LLM what actually is going on, right? This is kind of like if anybody listening is familiar with kind of semantic data as it's being used in kind of search optimization strategies where you use things like schema.org to say that you've got a product, it's of this type, it has this SKU. It's almost like a duplex of a communication to a web crawler about what is this thing that I'm talking about. Here's all the words, and here's some structured data about the words. So state one of maturity, or what I would say is basic immaturity, is where you just have schemas and there's really hardly any metadata in those schemas to tell anybody what's in them. You need to have a brain and you probably need to have a relationship to all the people who've been building and using that schema in order to know what it is. The next stage after that is when the schema begins to describe what it is that is actually in those columns and tables and how they relate to other things. And once you have that, I think that you actually can have some large language models start to be able to understand how they could query that data, what it means. They might even be able to learn how to join things together and things like that. Stage three is actually when I think you start to put together something that looks like a bit of a knowledge graph or sort of graph-like schema in front of it, where you describe the sorts of things that you care about, how they connect to other pieces of data, where those systems are. And that can become just an amazing resource for a language model to be able to know where to go and get something. Right. So now not only do you know what all the core entities are, but you have a chance to be able to ask those entities what their schema is like, what makes them them, right? A person has a first name, but an account might have a SKU, or an item type might have various sorts of tags on it. These sorts of questions allow the language model to get the context it needs in order to find other agents, to be able to ask questions about those things. And that maturity kind of between no metadata in the schema and a sort of rich schema representation of all the things that they care about is pretty vast. And I think 85% of the companies that I work with are really in the first narrow position of having essentially no metadata in their schemas. It's going to make that transition pretty difficult.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's some resources there that are in some ways just siloed in human terms that you could harness to resolve some of the issues you talked about. You've got the people who are on the structured data side of things, and then you've got people who are on the content side of things or on the knowledge management side of things who could also play a role in upgrading the metadata.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're not utilized directly in the process because you're so used to working, say, with the database folks that you forget about who's on the content side or the
Mm-hmm.
knowledge side.
Yep.
Is that also the case? Have you run across that situation?
I mean, I generally feel like on the content side, the metadata is more mature, right? There's
Hmm.
more taxonomies, there's more content models. There's a better mapping out of all of the content and what it's about than there is in the structured kind of database side. But the problem is it's just another set of tools, right? It's just
Yeah.
another, like, so now you've got a CMS, or maybe you've got, Adobe Experience Manager, and you've got a handful of taxonomies in Adobe Experience Manager over there, right? And some of that stuff comes out of a product taxonomy, which really has a source system in the ERP. And it's just like, as you unwind these data connections, you find that they just proliferate. They get copied. It's unclear how they're being copied, and so making sense of that unified whole is almost impossible. Most enterprises probably feel like their conceptual surface area, all of the things that they care about and track, is just ridiculously complicated and difficult. I think all enterprises feel that way.
Yeah.
But in reality, I think that you can design, you know, maybe it's as simple as a reference data management system or a master data management system. Maybe it's a data catalog, but you can begin to stitch together some worldviews about all the data that you have, where it exists, what the primary sources are. As you build that, I think up until AI, in many ways, it was really only the people who were very close to the data who understood the value of a data catalog, right? It was like somebody who had to write reports, and often they were given requests for reports, but they didn't even know where the data was or if the data existed at all. A data catalog would be super valuable to them, right? They would be able to go to
Hmm.
to data.world or whatever tool they had, and figure that out. Now I think that the primary user of these data catalogs, the primary user of these sort of enterprise knowledge graphs, is going to be AI. It's going to be the agents trying to figure out where something belongs, what's connected to what, who the product owner associated with a product is, how many dev teams are working on this particular software product. Like, the consumption of those large models now will be primarily through the AIs. That's I suppose that's my thesis. And we build those things not necessarily to because the information is beautiful and we want it all in one spot. We do it there to unify all of these different agents' terminology on the same ground, right? We ground many agents that can do many things on the same terminology, and we want to do that in one place because as they drift, we get more and more errors.
And it seems like there are going to be, in a large enterprise, different groups who have different priorities in terms of agents. They might have different ideas on how to use them. There might be some folks who are familiar with MCP and its capabilities. There might be others who might not be. I'm just sort of guessing here, but if you're working at a lower level, but you need the whole organization to just kind of come up with a streamlined, holistic approach to this, how do you even start?
I think, that if you follow the same good design criteria it's like, all politics is local, like all data management really is local, right? That like what we're doing here is not some sort of amazing, unique design that somebody was just born with. Like there's a set of tools, there's a discipline for how you go about organizing data. And as everybody in an organization or all major data owners and stewards begin to organize their data, they're going to do it, I think, more often than not towards the same use cases and towards the same design criteria, right? There's going to be a design language there. And so it's a mixture of both having all of the localities kind of improve, mature, and kind of like solidify their data strategies both at the grassroots and from the top, right? You can't wait. You can't do the top down approach where you say, okay, we've got these new data standards and everybody's going to do it this way and this is how we're going
Mm,
to write definitions. There's no way that's going to work. It hasn't worked really. I've never seen that work ever. You have the opposite strategy, which is that you don't try to formalize it all and you hope that everybody does it right. And that is good, but you will find there are multiple ways of doing it right to some extent, and you need to be able to kind of like blend and bring those two together. And so it requires some top-down sort of input, right? You need to referee a little bit about that. You need to decide what your design constraints are. And so I think the problem is the same problem that we've been facing here, which is that you can't take a top-down approach. You can't just let every 1,000 flowers bloom in every field and hope that it becomes a nice unified thing. You've kind of got to do both of those things simultaneously.
yeah. So let's say there's a planning exercise going on and execs are talking about um, certain initiatives. And of course, there are going to be buzzwords associated with those initiatives. And there's going to be a certain amount of pressure on the CIO to try and do some things that are innovative in relation to those buzzwords. Um, and of course, this has happened from time immemorial, depending on what phase of technology evolution you're in. But how do as an executive, how do you um, really try to make people realize that you're innovating in the ways they're wanting you to innovate, and maybe just giving them a gesture toward, okay, we're going to do this with the agents, or we're going to do this with this server, this MCP. Um, can you sort of describe how you could set up a project to satisfy people and yet make progress at the same time? Because they're going to be thinking you should do certain things with X, Y, and Z without really knowing how those things
Yeah.
really fit in.
Yeah, it's such the age-old question. It was like 15 years ago, it was a lot of people are kind of concerned about this cloud stuff, and what sort of cloud thing can we do? Like, we're all on premise and right. I mean, it really is the same thing. And so it's like you would hope that enough of, the CIO audience would have already jumped through a few of these hoops and learned something along the way. And I think again, you just have to like the goal is building the muscle, right? There is no doubt in my mind that AI and especially kind of like agentic style software is going to create some vast new companies, right? There's going to be an enormous amount of value that
Yeah.
springs up in the next 10 years right here. All of the big companies in 20 or 30 years from now, they're all kind of either starting now or about to get started. And so I think a CIO needs to be pretty concerned that they could be left in the dust pretty quickly, right? That their competitors could change the productivity or the efficiency arc of how they do business radically fast, and they could be left in the dust. And so I would say, on the one hand, you have to balance this sense of like, you need to get going because you really do need to get going, right? Somebody else is doing it, and if they beat you to it, it could be painful. And number two is you can't take the most risky use cases first, right? And at the same time, you can't find the simplest POCs to do that nobody cares about, right? Like there's nothing worse than doing a POC and rolling it out and doing a roadshow on it, and everybody thinks that was not a great idea to begin with and doesn't make sense to me at all. Likewise, you don't want to do that on something super sensitive and have people realize that you were just about to unleash, a 5% error rate on a massively important problem, right? It's like
Yeah.
the LLMs are going to get it wrong. Like the agents are they're going to mess it up, and there's going to be communication breakdowns and many other things, right? So if you can't afford to be wrong, you probably have the wrong place to start. Number one. Number two is it needs to be valuable, right? People need to look at it and see it as being valuable. And so we could take this conversation to the cloud or to CI/CD or to 1,000 other tech topics, and I think they're pretty much the same. But I think a lot of CIOs probably still don't even have frontier models that they trust to use. And so in some cases, the advice is going to be you're going to need an enterprise frontier model that you can use to do this stuff, right? If you really want to be on the cutting edge, you're not going to be able to run, Llama 3 on your small little cluster of NVIDIA GPUs. You need a frontier model, and you need to know that you've got the security and the privacy concerns that you can use it. And from my perspective, maybe 50% of companies have that relationship at any given scale. So first, get the tools. Second, find the developers and find the product people in your organization who are already doing this anyway, because they are. It's anybody who's got tech deep in them. They're already doing this. They think about it all the time. They're excited by it. Find those people, work with them to find some bit of value you can bring to the organization. Maybe it's just internal initially, but ideally it's for the customer. And make sure that you can handle the risk of being wrong sometimes, and just dig into it. Like that's my advice. It's fairly straightforward.
Yeah, there's the kind of a Venn diagram then that you have to put together so that you're addressing all the issues you just mentioned in one fell swoop with one project, just for starters,
Yeah.
and just sort of proving it out piece by piece. And once you get one of those projects behind you, then you can sort of build on top of it. Have you had that experience, and how does that go?
Yeah, absolutely. Getting started is always the most difficult part of it. And there's going to be missteps along the way, but in general, whatever missteps happen from your first project to your second or third or fourth, you can at least analyze in some way as relating to some particular dimension of the problem, right? Which is you didn't get the right model, or you thought you could connect two agents across a pretty, large conceptual leap, and you can't, or you were hoping that that the data, that using RAG, say to search for the related data that you wanted, that you had the wrong hypothesis about what would match and what wouldn't. And so you just look at all of those things according to the various facets that you can break it down on, and just begin to improve them. It's the same thing that you would do in any other tech enterprise, which is like find the nature of the failure and work on that particular failure and move it forward. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so just wondering if there's a hypothetical kind of example that you could come up with that would sort of spell out what somebody would do in a particular case to ground this in a concrete example.
how about we do this? You start with something, and then I'll try to pull the threads of it together.
Well, um, let's think about drug discovery, for example. Something where companies are used to using AI in certain ways. They might be fairly mature on the data side of things, and um, so they may be using agents in various ways already. And so, can we think about that context and how um, you're trying to hedge your bets? You're trying to make sure that the methods you're using are not exposing it to too much risk because you're in a regulated environment,
Mm.
and yet
Yeah.
you want to make progress.
Yeah, sure. So, in any sort of, say, pharma world, you've got the equivalent of, a CMS system that's right at the center of so much of the work. You call it a LIMS or an SDM or something like that, a laboratory information management system, scientific data management system, something like that. And these systems are generally kind of like they're the they're the place that all of the data from many different parts of the organization is supposed to come together into a complete picture. But really, so many of the instruments that are used in those worlds, and really so many of the software systems that are used in those worlds as well, are just not well connected. So there's still silos all over the place. And so in a LIM system, you've got a lot of people just retyping things. You've got a lot of people, saving PDFs and attaching them to a notebook. And in this world, like you've taken step one, which is get all the similar data together, but you haven't taken step two, which is normalize the semantics and be able to kind of reason across it, right? It's like a totally different world there. And so to me, like if I say was working with a team and they had a LIM system and they wanted to be able to fetch data, say from some other group that had a bunch of data, say from a sequencer being saved in a cloud bucket or something like that, a tool, just a simple kind of MCP tool operating inside of the LIMS to be able to understand the metadata that of a sequencer run that's related to a particular notebook entry could be a great place to start, right? Like I feel like, one of the things that Anthropic just mentioned a couple of days ago when they released their new kind of like installable remote MCPs, one that I thought was very interesting was one about just a simple one to control your Chrome browser via an MCP and AppleScript, right? Let Claude essentially be able to like open up tabs and do and have access to some extent to your Chrome browser. Imagine doing that on the LIMS, right? Imagine if in the LIM system you could have a single portal into all these different data systems, right? You've got all sorts of kind of like quality control data over here in this system, all sorts of experimental data over here. You've got some regulatory stuff over there. Can you make the LIM system the single pane of glass for all those systems by just connecting them up in a read-only fashion, right? We're not talking about changing data and pushing it. You don't have to worry at all about data audits, those sorts of things. But bringing data together, like data together in that system and normalizing it, I mean, it seems like a straightforward place. That's probably what I would be thinking about in that landscape.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense because you're helping the company to become mature, starting with the people who are most likely to be able to help you to begin with, and you're helping them along with their tooling, making it more capable, and you're sort of breaking down silos in the process. So there's a lot of you're killing two birds with one stone in a sense.
Yeah, and
Um,
it may not sound very ambitious, but when you look at how few developers there are in a lot of organizations and how much good work there is to do, the idea that you're going to build custom front ends or you're going to write plugins for existing enterprise systems to hook up with other data, I think a lot of kind of data leaders have seen that these internal projects for data visibility, like they can just drag on and on. They're slow, they're hard, they're brittle, software changes, you get new releases, things break all the time, right? This is where the MCP kind of agent thing can really shine through, which is like, think about them as incredibly straightforward ways of connecting distant systems, right? So it's a very lightweight way to connect them. And that is what I feel like it's like the LLM has become really the glue by which you can integrate these other systems. And the means of doing that is really via the MCP. Semantics underneath it are important to make sure that you're talking about the same thing from system to
Hmm.
system. And I kind of left that out. But as we get into that, anybody working in life science is already going to have, in all likelihood, fairly developed terminologies. Maybe you're using terminologies from Pistoia, or you're using terminologies from allotrope, things like that. I mean, there's another layer in there that we can unpack. But MCP agentic flows for these sorts of visibility, observability things, to me, are essentially maybe not zero risk, because you can always get the wrong information kind of into the wrong place and really confuse people. But we're not talking about changing data. We're not talking about editing things. We're not talking about having to correct problems of real consequence outside of maybe the wrong data kind of got connected uh, to the other wrong data, right? So something like that.
Yeah. For those who aren't super familiar with MCP, and it does a lot of different things. Can you just explain how it's relevant in this circumstance, and just a bit about what exactly it's doing?
Yeah. MCP, and I heard somebody say, is kind of like an API for APIs. So
Yeah.
in the world of computer science, where everything's solved with another level of abstraction, now we get APIs for APIs. But
Yeah.
really, what we're doing is we're trying to tell a language model how they can do something, right? So we can say, the classic example here is like, you have this thing called a tool that the LLM can utilize, right? So one of these tools might be like, what's the temperature outside tool, right? And the LLM knows how to ask something else, which is actually connected to real sensor data, what the temperature is. And in order to do that, the LLM needs to understand the intent of the user, right? When I say, what's the temp going to be tomorrow morning? The LLM is the thing that understands, oh, okay, well, this user wants to know about the temperature and they want to know about something in the future. It's a sort of forecast. And the MCP is the way in which they can connect to these tools in a general way, right? So the MCP abstracts the large language model native functionality around tool calling, and it also abstracts on the other side the API it will be calling, right? So in many ways, you can kind of think about these MCPs as both describing in what, like, for what sorts of intents is this tool useful on one hand, and number two, how would you go about asking for the data? So MCPs, I think, are just fundamental to when you think about agentic AI.
Yeah. And Anthropic is behind the MCP, the bona fide MCP, and then there are other alternatives that have that kind of MCP functionality, but they're called something else, that other providers are coming up with.
Yeah, there seems to be a fair bit of agreement right
Hmm.
now to me that the MCP, as it is a protocol, I mean, it's early and nascent, and I'm sure will change over time, like anything. But I think it's settling in, right? This
Yeah.
idea, because right, you say you're a vendor, you're Atlassian, and you sell Jira, right? You want to be able to allow large language models to query Jira or create tickets or do whatever you want. And you don't want to have to make integrations for chat, for OpenAI, for Anthropic, for Grok, for
Hmm.
everybody, right? So
Yeah.
it's just a clear need, and I think it's going to be settled. If it's not already settled, and I think it probably is, it will be settled very soon, because the need is just massive, and so it's going to have to get agreed on, because too many people want it.
Yeah. It's true. And at the same time, these same companies are trying to break things just when they're testing them, and they're trying to be transparent about what happens when they try to break the system. And Anthropic was prominent in the press recently for disclosing that they managed to break their system, and the result was that the system was pondering um, blackmailing an employee based on an
Yeah.
email the employee had sent. Um, so there are these threats that loom large and that are getting discussed in the press, but it sounds like you're talking about a very feasible way that doesn't really open up this level of risk at all.
Yeah, that this sort of I think they call it red card testing, where you essentially do your best to activate a language model into its worst possible personality or whatever. I mean, really is a fascinating literature. And I think if I remember correctly, Anthropic was running those tests against everybody's models. Actually, I think like at least was they
Could
more or
be,
less
yeah.
said that like almost every language model. I don't know if they were saying it was reasoning models only, but almost all the major frontier models were doing that. And there was a case of a language model as well trying to get past a CAPTCHA by, I don't know, I can't remember how it worked, but offering somebody on Fiverr, some money for them to get through the CAPTCHA because the language model claimed that that it had some accessibility issues and needed this done by somebody else. And so it's clear that in the literature we've trained these deviant behaviors into the language models. Is absolutely there. I think it's very unwise to assume that that can't happen. And so really what you can do there is you can just put crazy guardrails on things, right? It's like,
Yeah.
this is why I love querying. Language models that write queries and pass those queries to databases, where you can permiss the database itself. Any tables that agent shouldn't have access to can come out. There's ways of putting maybe not straitjackets, but near straitjackets on the language models. But if in the end, you're just working with raw language, then you have to be open to that. That's why I like the constraints there, which is you're able to call APIs. You're not able to make new ones and call them, but you can call existing ones. You can query systems, those sorts of things, anything where we can narrow it down and tighten it up and make sure, like, really just that the discourse is very, very narrow. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing. That whole alignment thing is awesome to ponder.
So maybe we could summarize the best practices that you've talked about today, because I think they're really important. It's sort of the difference between starting a viable, helpful project and one that's not, um, making sure that what you're doing is safe, and sort of harnessing the resources that you have. Um, and getting started with something that might actually deliver some value. Can we just sort of summarize what the best practices were that we talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, you just did a great job there, but always come back to the same few things here, which is like start small but valuable, right? Small alone is not great. Valuable gets you into problems because of scope, things like that. It needs to be small, it needs to be valuable. You need to be committed to whatever you're doing if it works well to actually supporting it in production for a bit. I think any POCs you're like, it's never going to go to production. I just think you can delude yourself about the value of a POC very, very well. So the plan should be you're going to start small and it's going to go to production, to find the people in your organization who already care and already do this because they're all over, right? You
Yeah,
don't want to just because the team sits in the right part of the org chart doesn't mean that they're the team to do this work, right? If they're not excited, if the people who you're asking to do this work are not super stoked, frankly, to do it, then you should be looking for another team because you want the people who are really motivated by this. Um, you want to focus on, I think, connecting systems and doing observability, visibility stuff initially, just because I think most of us are still very cautious about agents changing data autonomously. Even software developers who are using tools like Cursor and Claude Code and other things, for the most part, they're paying attention to everything that's done. And even if they're not reading every line of code that's being generated, they're scanning it and keeping their eyes open, sort of thing. And so this idea of agents that are just acting autonomously, like, that's still a ways away.
Yeah.
Be thoughtful and careful about that. Know that you're going to be you're using a language model, you're using a big probability machine. You're going to get some stuff wrong. If you chose a use case and that use case doesn't allow you to be wrong, it's the wrong use case, right? It's like, you need to be able to cut yourself some slack. You need to be able to know that being at 85% is better than 0%, right? These sorts of, it's very easy to become so risk averse that you don't realize that huge increments of value that come at the expense of sometimes misinformation, or kind of like, how do I try to put this? It's not exactly misinformation, but more just like where the dots don't really connect and they look like they do connect. You need to find those use cases where it's still worth having it. And that's not always. I think when we use language models, the more you use them, you develop this sixth sense that there's always something that's a little questionable in them. And, I think that's an important thing to have. And you need to find a use case where you can still have that and feel good about it.
Absolutely. And it just seems like the MCP part of our discussion really underscored for me that you've got lots of tools out there that have capabilities that people understand, and you can harness the power of them much more easily in certain cases, and sort of cut to the chase in terms of managing the APIs, for example, in a much better way by using something like an MCP for that purpose. Super discussion today, Adam. I appreciate all the insights and your willingness to share today.
Thanks so much. It's awesome to be able to talk to you, and I look forward to more of them.
Okay,
All right.
we'll talk to you soon then.
Thanks so much.